I wonder if there will ever be a time when we can talk about the history of mainstream animation without also talking about Disney. My guess is probably not within our lifetimes. So one of the tactics Disney uses to maintain their image of perennial, legendary quality is omission. Other folks, notably Lindsay Ellis, have talked about Disney's attempts at historical revisionism in the form of the live-action remakes of some of their classic movies. But that tactic is meant for properties that people actually care about. It's a preemptive defense against criticism of outdated elements, as well as a manipulation of our collective nostalgia for the sake of financial gain. But when it comes to Disney movies and/or shows that failed, either financially or in terms of general audience appeal and longevity, Disney's approach is to just not do anything with them. They don't merchandise these properties after their initial release, they don't feature them on social media or on their streaming apps, and they definitely don't greenlight remakes or sequels of these properties. At least not yet. We'll see if they get desperate enough one day. Chicken Little is one of these properties. It's a vaguely memorable movie, and vaguely memorable is pretty good compared to the average children's film, but compared to much of Disney's catalog, it's terrible. I'm going to be looking back to give this movie another shot and decide whether this is a Disney flick that the studio was right to leave behind. As swiftly as I can, I would like to give this movie a reasonable amount of historical context, because Chicken Little belongs to a category of animated movies I call streetwise movies, which were a pretty big deal in the early 2000s. This isn't a formal category, obviously, it's just how I refer to movies, especially animated movies, whose writing and sense of humor feels more grounded and real world. Disney's Hercules, for example, is a streetwise movie. Oliver and Company is a streetwise movie. The Emperor's New Groove is definitely a streetwise movie, and we'll be coming back to that one in particular shortly. These are movies that feel less lofty. They might make references to real-world events or celebrities, and the settings might resemble our own world. The majority of DreamWorks features, for example, especially early DreamWorks features, are all streetwise movies. And I definitely understand why Disney would want to avoid the streetwise vibe most of the time, especially for features. For one thing, it's not a tone that matches up with the classic animated films, many of which were just fairy tales set in fantastical settings. Audiences could relate to characters' internal conflicts, but not so much the specifics of their situations. Even a lot of the Disney Renaissance movies stay far away from the streetwise feeling. One of the big downsides of streetwise movies is that they become dated very quickly. They have a better chance of connecting with audiences upon release, they feel more accessible, but in time, they will feel very much of their era. In contrast, many of the Disney classics feel timeless, thanks not only to their visuals, the source material, and their settings, but also their music, styled after classic musical theater. The Emperor's New Groove is one of the only streetwise movies to hold up extremely well, despite not performing well financially. In fact, based on the numbers, it looks like it was a terrible flop, but it's also just a fantastically funny movie that also has some excellent visuals throughout. And if you don't know the history of its production, then you'll be surprised to hear that it was originally going to be the opposite of a streetwise movie. I'll rush through this because a lot of people have talked about it before, but The Emperor's New Groove was originally set to mimic the Lion King tone. And if I remember correctly, the co-director of The Lion King, Roger Allers, was the original director of Emperor's New Groove. But long story short, production was going very poorly. You can see it firsthand in the band behind-the-scenes documentary called The Sweatbox. So almost at the last minute, basically all progress was scrapped, and the team had to start over with a new director, Mark Dindal, who also directed Chicken Little a few years later. Mark Dindal actually hasn't directed too much. He directed Cats Don't Dance in the 90s, he directed Emperor's New Groove, he directed this, and apparently he's set to direct a new Garfield movie as well, which is different. And And I have to imagine that swooping in and saving the day with New Groove made it possible for him to direct Chicken Little down the line. And despite this movie not getting talked about nearly as much as New Groove, and despite it being CG instead of 2D animation, the two movies actually share a lot of DNA, especially when it comes to humor. But in terms of production, the behind-the-scenes featurette for Chicken Little really makes it seem like it was just a standard production line kind of movie. The basic Chicken Little story itself is an ancient folktale that's been through tons of iterations, apparently over the course of more than 25 centuries. That's a very long time. So in other words, you can use this material without having to pay for the rights. You're not licensing it. And it's also just a story that everybody knows. That is 100% in Disney's wheelhouse. They love to adapt stuff that just exists in the collective cultural consciousness. And I don't really mind that approach too much either. It's just kind of smart, as long as it doesn't lead to the appropriation of stories with strong cultural roots. One of the more interesting tidbits mentioned in that Chicken Little featurette that I talked about earlier was that the character of Chicken Little for this adaptation was originally a female character, but Michael Eisner himself told them to make the character a boy.
The original story of Chicken Little is a girl.
And Michael, the very first time he said, I think Chicken Little would be more interesting as a boy.
So there you go, a definitive example of a Hollywood executive just vetoing a female lead. And if we believe the estimated budget of $150 million, then it sure seems like Disney had a lot of confidence in this movie. And I guess I can see why. For the time, it sure seems to have had all the right pieces. The title naturally has a lot of name recognition, and the cast featured well-known celebrities like Zach Braff, who was smack in the middle of Scrubs fame, Joan Cusack, who had just delivered a stellar family movie performance in School of Rock 2 years prior, and even America's sweetheart, Gary Marshall. I don't know, can we put him on a coin or something, or just like a permanent billboard just to remind us that things are gonna be okay?
I think in life, if you're a creative person, you need somebody to come with you who says how great you are. If you're a person who can't say how great you are yourself. I was never good at blowing my own horn, as they say.
And while this movie performed better than Emperor's New Groove in terms of raw numbers, it still probably didn't do that well. So you guys know the routine. There is a worldwide box office number, and then we subtract the estimated budget. Budgets themselves are never accurately reported, but they give us an idea at the very least. Then we also have to subtract marketing costs, which as a rule of thumb for big Hollywood studios are equal to the production budget. So that would make Chicken Little easily a net loss, unless the budget was significantly lower or they didn't spend much on marketing. In any case, it definitely wasn't a runaway success. As for what Disney Animation was up to around this time, Home on the Range was the year before, Meet the Robinsons came 2 years later, and 4 years after Chicken Little, we got The Princess and the Frog, the last major 2D animated Disney feature. And before we really get going, I should say that I don't want to give the impression that no one cares about Chicken Little. It definitely seems to have a small following, and this is a bit of a spoiler for the rest of the video, but I happen to care about Chicken Little too. But I also don't think it's a movie people tend to think about very much. Okay, so I had an idea of how I could maybe illustrate where Chicken Little is situated, how it's presented in the Disney Plus streaming app. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to dig through the animated movies category and see how far we have to go to actually come across Chicken Little if we were just doing some casual browsing. So we have our first title here, second, here's 3, 4, 5, 6, 17, 19, 20, 21, 4, 35, 36, 37, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 51, 82, 90, 91. 91 deep in the animated movies category. Also, this movie came out 17 years ago. It would be understandable if a bunch of youngsters have never even heard of it before. And side note, if you are a young person who has never heard of or watched this movie before, please tell me about it. Leave a comment. And I don't think this movie should be forgotten, regardless of how we all feel about it. There's good and bad here to learn from, and it all starts with the visuals. This movie came along at an interesting time for Disney. In fact, Chicken Little is the very first Walt Disney Animation CG feature. Okay, so this can be kind of confusing. but Walt Disney Animation Studios, or WDAS, is a specific studio within the giant Disney monolith. They don't make every single animated Disney movie. Disney works with different studios and production companies on various projects. Pixar is a good example. Disney has oversight of these other studios, but they each operate on their own. But WDAS is like the A-team for first-party animated Disney movies. And the studio itself, where it all goes down, it's actually not too far from where I am. In fact, every time I drive by it, I go like, oh, hey, I suddenly remember this exists. So yes, Pixar released plenty of full CG features under the Disney umbrella back in the 90s. And yes, previous 2D WDAS features like Atlantis and Treasure Planet incorporated CG elements, but Chicken Little is the first full CG movie from this studio. And you know what? It kind of shows. Actually, it's fun to see them making a real point of emphasizing CG animation basics in the behind-the-scenes materials here.
He manipulates a computer-generated puppet, but it's done on the computer.
It also feels like they're quelling potential backlash, like, hey, we haven't forgotten about traditional animation, like we're still using those principles.
There's a great example of the use of squash and stretch in the movie.
And they are indeed applying classic animation principles to Chicken Little. Squash and stretch, anticipation, follow through, it's there. And compared to a lot of the competition around that time, I'm pretty impressed with just how much the visuals hold up. They don't hold up completely, but after a remaster, it would probably look like a modern movie. Better lighting, for example, would help out a lot. And this was also in the early days of realistic looking hair or fur. You can't really look at these details too closely. And the chicken's combs, like the red bits on their heads, have this really gross texture applied. It kind of looks like raw, red, dry skin. And even if that's accurate to real life chickens, that's not a good reason to make something look so ugly in this children's movie for children, especially on our main character. It's very strange. I'm also not a big fan of how character models transition from pose to pose. A lot of the stops and starts seem very abrupt, which immediately looks unnatural to the human eye. I have no idea whether this is the result of some sort of technical limitation or maybe the rigging of these models. Maybe it was an artistic choice, but it's definitely something that makes the movie feel older to me. So what about the overall art direction? It's fine. Obviously, this is a very subjective topic, but the color palettes and the designs of the environments are just okay. It's a world full of animals, and that sometimes affects how various objects are designed. The Chicken Little household looks like a chicken coop. Fish have to keep themselves in water, but in a lot of ways, it just feels like a goofy cartoon town. It's a stereotypical version of Main Street, USA, and we know how much Disney likes that fictionalized image of American life. Then, the alien content in the movie provides an opportunity for contrast. This is a good opportunity to provide a really brief plot breakdown. If you're worried about spoilers for some reason, I apologize, I guess. Chicken Little thinks the sky is falling. He doesn't have proof, so they assume he got hit on the head by an acorn, which is the original story, and nobody believes him. He's an embarrassment. He continues to be an embarrassment until he finds out that, oh no, the sky is actually kind of falling because there are aliens, and then they essentially invade, going after one of the lost alien children, and he's validated and he has to save the day. And throughout all this, he has to also form a more healthy relationship with his dad. Okay, we basically have just one sequence in the movie that is on board a spaceship. I mean, there's a little scene later on, but that's about it. And this sequence feels appropriately cold, but it also just feels kind of bare. It's a bit placeholdery in terms of design. It just looks like kind of generic alien stuff. And the designs of the aliens themselves, well, they have two designs, don't they? They have intimidating like mech suit things with Doc Ock tentacles, and then they're the actual cute fluffy aliens that are inside the mech suits. And I actually like the fluffy guys. They're just kind of like troll doll hair without the troll, and that works pretty well, especially during the final reveal at the very end when we meet the lost aliens' parents. The spaceships themselves are pretty standard flying saucers, and in general, I'm not surprised that the aliens don't really draw too much attention. The aliens are only here for the sake of plot. It's not a movie about aliens. It's not like about First Contact or anything. And it's the same case when it comes to the town itself. It's not meant to be the appeal of the movie. And at least for me, movies that stick to one central location aren't that interesting, especially in animation. And here, we're supposed to be focusing on the characters, and unfortunately, the character stuff isn't that interesting. I'll talk more about that later. This could have been a sci-fi adventure movie where Chicken Little and his buddies and his dad get swept away into outer space. And even though this validates Chicken Little's warnings, his dad still won't give him the time of day. And meanwhile, Chicken Little has to use his ingenuity to solve all these weird alien space challenges. But instead, we stay in this ho-hum town that just looks fine, filled with ass characters who also look fine. And that's really all I have to say about the visuals. It's an unremarkable looking movie that was probably an important step for WDAS in terms of animating in 3D. So a lot of people who follow animation also care a lot about voice acting, and for good reason. Voice acting is a unique skill, and it's integral to the finished product. It's also a huge factor in relation to just how much a particular viewer connects with various characters. Within voice acting, celebrity voice acting is a valid point of concern, I guess we could call it. Back in the early 2000s especially, it was very common to cast a celebrity as a voice actor for an animated movie solely because they were super famous, and that might attract funding to the project, and hopefully it would also get audiences to come to the theater. Look to DreamWorks, Shark Tale, Over the Hedge, Madagascar. Very much that reasoning behind it. Celebrity voice actor casting can also be a lazy way to make a children's movie more appealing to adults, specifically like the parents who are going to bring their kids to see the movie. However, simply being a celebrity doesn't mean that someone will be good or bad at voice acting. And in a broad sense, I think that Disney has consistently done a good job of casting celebrities who are also skilled voice actors. And that's exactly what happened with Chicken Little. I do think fame was still a factor in certain casting choices, Zach Braff especially, but no one feels out of place to me. Every one of the leads has a distinctive voice, and they're putting plenty of flavor into these roles. Amy Sedaris is unsurprisingly fantastic as the ultra-snobby rival, Foxy Loxy. Don Knotts shows up for a bit part as the mayor. Patrick Stewart is in this movie. I don't really know why. He just plays the teacher who is a sheep. I'm not upset about it. He does a good job, but I feel like they probably had to spend a whole bunch of money to get him there, and it's such a small part. Wallace Shawn plays the principal. Not too much to say there. And we also get Fred Willard and Catherine O'Hara as Kirby's parents. Obviously, they've worked on a bunch of stuff together before, especially with Christopher Guest. They're both very funny. Patrick Warburton has a couple of lines, then he's out. And Harry Shearer and Adam West also have little cameos. So there's no doubt that they packed this thing full of known names. And for the most part, these are just funny people who can more than handle the witty, self-aware humor. But of course, most of the burden is put on our leads. Zach Braff as Chicken Little, Gary Marshall as Buck Cluck, Joan Cusack as Abby Mallard, and Steve Zahn as Runt. Let's cover Runt and Abby real quick. Runt is very one note. To me, he's just supposed to be comedy relief. He's a misfit, and he's really into iconic female vocalists. Steve Zahn is okay here. He sounds very much like Steve Zahn, and in hindsight, his performance also sounds a lot like Andy Samberg. Do you get that vibe too?
Yeah, that's right. It's Frozen P.
What is up, everybody?
It's just this kind of goofy, like dumb voice performance that involves a lot of yelling. There's a moment in the third act when Runt crashes a car into a building and his singing is interrupted by just like this crazy screech thing. And when the movie came out, I thought that that was very funny. But these days, I just kind of want that sort of thing to stop. Runt is definitely not the funniest character to me, even though that's his job in the movie. Abby is a different story. I like Abby. Her character design is a play on the Ugly Duckling, and yeah, she's funny to look at, especially because she's smiling so much at the time. Of the three friends, she's the most self-confident. She's not bothered by bullying, and she can easily look past Chicken Little's status as an outcast to see his best traits. I guess it goes without saying that this all comes to life thanks to Joan Cusack, who's pretty much doing her regular shtick in terms of the voice itself, but she also manages to give the character a decent amount of range. Also, let's acknowledge one of the challenges of playing this character. The script relies on Abby to make certain things clear. She articulates the core conflict between Chicken Little and his father, and she also tells Chicken Little very early on how to overcome this conflict, introducing the concept of closure, which is probably something that most kids watching this have never heard of before. It would have been very easy for these lines to make the character sound out of place or just like a know-it-all, but Abby just doesn't come across that way. She's just helpful, and even though she has an obvious crush on Chicken Little, that doesn't end up defining her character either. So good job. I think it works really well. Now it's time to talk about Chicken Little and Buck Cluck. We'll have more on them as characters in the section on writing, but for now, let's discuss whether we believe Zach Braff and Gary Marshall as a detached father-son combo who want to connect on a deeper level. It's a dynamic we've seen many times before and since, and if this was a live-action movie, the kid character would probably be played by a kid, not an adult, which gives the actor a pretty easy job. They just have to act like a bratty kid. For example, Hook. It's not a great movie, but the kid who plays Jack, Charlie Porzmo, without actually giving an especially impressive performance. And on the other side, you've got Robin Williams, who can 100% pull off bad dad who genuinely wants to do better. But in an animated movie with a strained father-son dynamic, the son character is much more likely to be the lead. Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, which feels like Chicken Little in a few ways actually, really needed solid performances from both Bill Hader and James Caan to make that dynamic work. So here's the thing. I think that Zach Braff and Gary Marshall are both believable in their own roles, like individually. But when they're sharing a scene, which happens quite a bit, I don't really buy it. Maybe what I'm trying to describe here is a lack of chemistry, and I think that would have less to do with the actors they chose than whether they recorded their lines together. Like, at the same time. I know with plenty of animated TV shows, for example, the voice cast will record at the same time. But I've also heard that for a lot of animated movies, they just bring in one of the cast members at a time. Maybe it's a scheduling thing. And sure, if you have lines recorded for one character, you could play them for the following actor to give them something to play off of. But whatever the process was here behind the scenes, I don't think it worked. They feel very awkward together. And I know what you're thinking. That's the point. They're supposed to be detached and weird around each other. The problem is they always feel awkward around each other, even in the moments when they're supposed to be getting along, and even at the end of the movie after they've worked through everything. On his own, Zach Braff is believable as a pubescent chicken boy, and Gary Marshall is a very likable father figure. But together, they don't click for me. I start to hear them more as two adult men / entertainment industry professionals speaking into microphones. And I don't think the pacing of the story helps that out one bit. Remember that whole streetwise thing that I was talking about? I think it manifests most strongly in this movie's dialogue. Chicken Little definitely has a similar sense of humor to Emperor's New Groove, as well as plenty of non-Disney movies, and this is the best aspect of the movie by far. It's just funny. It's not funny all of the time, but it's funny often enough that it's easy to watch as an adult. But you also have to be okay with self-referential jokes. I mean, heck, the movie starts out with Buck Cluck talking directly to the audience, running through various well-known story openings. And I don't know why, like they could just cut that and the movie would feel the same. In the first sequence, we see footage from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Later on, we get a Star Wars reference, and Abby also references War of the Worlds in a line that I'm pretty sure made it into the trailer for the movie. And I know it's not part of the script, of course, but Chicken Little is stuffed full of licensed music, including a Bare Naked Ladies track that I'm pretty sure was written specifically for this movie. Some of the other songs here are just really obvious picks whose lyrics have literal ties to what's happening on screen, which is a pet peeve of mine in terms of music supervision. So during the alien invasion, we hear "It's the End of the World as We Know It," which was also featured in another alien invasion movie, Independence Day. Shake a Tail Feather is in the movie because chickens. Chicken Little sings "We Are the Champions" after winning the sports game, and when Runt is trying to not get vaporized by aliens, he sings "I Will Survive." All these tracks definitely contribute to the streetwise vibe, since they contrast how the Disney classics are known for including tons of completely original music, original show tunes, no less. So the movie feels dated for a number of reasons, but we can definitely argue about whether that dated quality is charming or just annoying. Personally, I don't mind it. I still laugh at a lot of the jokes, and I respect the script for not feeling like the Disney Renaissance movies. And it kind of fits with this being the first Disney CG movie. CG was still kind of trendy at the time. Maybe they knew that this movie was destined to not feel timeless, so they didn't even bother trying. And a big benefit of a Streetwise movie is that it's allowed to have a light and airy tone. It doesn't have to take itself too seriously. Just think of something like Beauty and the Beast. It's a fairy tale that's played very straight. There's humor, but not much. And when it comes to the lead characters, you can't really imagine them telling a joke. It's just a morality tale. It kind of has to be up its own ass. Chicken Little is obviously based on a folktale, but it's also an adaptation. It's a modernization. This world is supposed to feel similar to our world. With that in mind, does the messaging of the original story survive the adaptation? Not really. And does that matter? Not really. I don't think so. So what's the moral of the original Chicken Little folktale? I guess, don't jump to conclusions or don't overreact. It also kind of feels like it ties in with The Boy Who Cried Wolf, where people will just stop believing you after a while. And yeah, I mean, these are relevant lessons to this day, but building an entire children's movie around those lessons kind of sounds like a nightmare. This just isn't the kind of messaging that captures the attention of modern audiences, right? Chicken Little, the original story, is one of those shut up and eat your dinner kinds of fairy tales or folk tales. It's designed to get kids to act right. And in contrast, a lot of modern messaging in children's entertainment tends to be more like uplifting or empowering or motivational. So what is the messaging of this version of the Chicken Little story? The original story is here, essentially, like on a literal level, but it only takes a few minutes to get through. Chicken Little causes a ruckus, but he appears to have overreacted, thinking that an acorn falling on his head meant the sky was falling. Okay, so then what is this movie actually about? Because that's only a couple minutes of the runtime. Is it delivering any messaging of real value at all? Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide, but from my own perspective, I do think it's valuable in its emphasis of the need for healthy communication between family members. That's really the messaging that I'm taking away from this movie. Even today, shin deep into the 21st century, we're still in a cultural place where young boys often don't get educated in the ways of healthy emotional expression and or general emotional intelligence, increasing the chances that those repressed emotions will vent in unhealthy or harmful ways, e.g. internet trolling or membership in online communities telling them it's okay to repress everything and stick to stereotypical and outdated definitions of male identity. So yeah, having the movie focus on a father and son who are both bad at expressing their feelings is a perfectly acceptable way to make a simple but powerful point. Talk about how you feel. Communicate with loved ones. That might sound pretty basic to a lot of people, but for someone who struggles with this sort of thing, that can be a lot tougher than it sounds. It's also just kind of funny that it takes an apocalyptic event to push Chicken Little over the edge and finally talk with his dad about what's bothering him. So yes, the father-son thing is old hat, but even if that's all we take away from the movie, it's still a decent bit of messaging. Though, again, it's not really related to the source material. But how well is all of this stuff executed? I already talked about the lack of chemistry between these two characters, both before and after their breakthrough, and we're not supposed to feel that way about it. There should be a noticeable difference in how the two interact before and after. There's some surface level teamwork stuff going on during that final action sequence, and maybe that's the best we could have hoped for from this movie, but it's not enough for me. And there's something weird about Buck's lines post-closure. He kind of sounds like someone who's just saying things because that's what he thinks the other person wants to hear. it comes across as fake. And maybe it feels that way because the turnaround happens so fast and so close to the ending. It feels rushed because it is. So let's go back to my wacky idea about having the bulk of the movie take place on a spaceship or just away from the town somewhere. Sure, we would no longer have the town constantly reminding us that Chicken Little is an outcast and that, by extension, Buck's reputation as a town hero is fading. But I also don't think that we need that reminder throughout the whole movie. We understand this stuff very early on, and both characters could still be redeemed in the eyes of the town during the finale. But sending Buck and Chicken Little on a journey together would offer so many more opportunities for the two of them to develop and grow. Because of course Chicken Little isn't the only one who needs to be better about sharing his feelings. Putting these characters in outer space would take Buck out of his comfort zone and probably place Chicken Little inside his comfort zone. It's kind of a role reversal thing. Maybe there could even be moments when Chicken Little feels embarrassed by Buck instead of the other way around. Could be interesting. And the friends can still be there too, offering comedy and commentary. Buck would feel the need to be the default leader, protector of all these kids, but he also wouldn't have a creative approach to solving weird space alien problems, which would allow Chicken Little to impress with his creativity and initiative. But that's not what we got. We stay trapped in this small, not so interesting town, and Chicken Little and Buck have these interstitial scenes where they fail to get through to one another. And it's not the worst father-son narrative either, even though it's not very well executed. Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs has an even clumsier progression to mutual father-son respect and understanding. I believe that initial conflict, but the way it develops is just not very good. Basically, you have a story happen that's unrelated to the father-son thing, and then at the very end of the movie, almost just as a bonus, the dad suddenly sees Flint's value. Thing is, that movie had a lot of other stuff going on to keep the audience entertained and engaged. There's a somewhat substantial romance subplot, at least for a children's movie. There's tons of wacky action, and even though we're stuck in the Swallow Falls location for most of the movie, that location is transformed by the food apocalypse. Also, it's just more consistently funny than Chicken Little, but hey, subjective. Overall, I'm mildly impressed by the writing of Chicken Little. It's funnier than the average Disney movie and also more relaxed than the average Disney movie. There's a point to the story, even though it feels a bit hollow in its execution, and things wrap up pretty nicely, except for that weird thing where Foxy Loxy basically gets electroshock therapy and they just leave her that way because it makes her more tolerable. That seems pretty weird. And I'm gonna roll this right into my closing thoughts on the movie here. Chicken Little is unexceptional. And contrary to the content creation commandments, unexceptional media is still worth talking about. In fact, most media is unexceptional. That's kind of how bell curves work. Understanding what makes mediocre media mediocre can also help us understand the best and the worst ever media that the internet loves to talk about so very much. Chicken Little is an example of a Disney movie that's trying to feel less like a typical Disney movie, seemingly taking inspiration from Disney's direct competition in the animated feature space. And since its release, the push for streetwise movies hasn't really persisted, well, at least within Disney. And instead, Disney now provides those kinds of movies through their massive acquisitions of previous competitors. And meanwhile, their in-house movies tend to look and sound pretty similar to each other. Chicken Little is an early CG effort from Disney, and with just a couple of exceptions, CG would become the studio's new standard for features. A decision that seems to be permanent. Chicken Little is an acceptable movie that's reasonably entertaining, and it's an expression of a moment in Disney history that's now long gone. And maybe that's why it's been left behind by the studio. Maybe Disney is just comfortable with its current creative culture, but as we're seeing more and more clearly, a desire for change and evolution is essential for delivering creative variety. And creative variety is just not what Disney is about these days. And there we have it. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. The script is gone. So I just want to say thanks a lot. I really appreciate the support. Any views mean a lot on this channel. And yeah, I've actually been pretty excited about the project overall. And we'll see how the editing turns out. I hope I did well. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.